Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for our second end of internship presentation by Melissa Engle. Melissa has been with us for 10 weeks, and she has done a fairly impressive amount of work in the time that she's been with us, and we'll be sad to see her go. Before I hand over to Melissa to give her the chance to explain and show you some of the work that she's done with us, I'd like to take a second to thank FOGAH for their generous sponsorship of our pre-programmed summer conservation internship. It's only with their support that we're able to keep producing this program every year. So a big thank you to them. And without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Melissa.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? All right, fantastic. I am very excited to be here showing the staff and friends, family, and peers that have been able to join virtually what I have been up to this summer. And yes, I'm just very grateful to be here and very excited to share all that I have learned. So before I get into what, there it is, okay. So I would first like to introduce myself. My name is Melissa Engle. I am from Naperville, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. Fun fact is my favorite color is chartreuse. I love it. My room is that color at home. So when I say I love it, I really mean it. And some hobbies that I enjoy are crochet, reading, crosswords, and jigsaw puzzles. I'm pretty indoorsy. And I also want to talk about how I got here. I was first introduced to chemistry in 8th grade, and that's also when I started taking elective art classes. And that year is when I seriously became interested in studying both of those in high school. And right after my sophomore year of high school, I actually learned about conservation at a presentation at the Art Institute of Chicago. And that's where I actually saw in real time these two subjects that seemingly were unrelated being used together in a very small field that not many people knew about. And ever since then, it was in my mind and something I wanted to do. So when I was looking at colleges, I specifically chose a liberal arts college where I could study the sciences and the humanities. And I graduated from St. Olaf College, which is in Northfield, Minnesota, in 2021, completing 3 majors in chemistry, studio art, and art history. However, my schooling did end during COVID pandemic, which made it a little difficult to start putting feelers out there into the field. I didn't really have any options lined up, and it was hard to get experience in college because everything was closed. So I spent time substitute teaching at my local elementary school while I started doing informational interviews with conservators and conservation scientists and started applying for conservation opportunities. And I am very grateful that after many applications and interviews, I finally got my foot in the door when up-and-coming paintings conservator in Chicago took me under her wing, even though she was hoping for a graduate level intern. So shout out to Daniela for taking me on as a pre-program intern when she had never done that before. I assisted with all sorts of tasks at this private practice, specializing in the conservation of easel paintings, including doing research on materials and artists, mockups, condition assessments, writing reports, and assisting in all sorts of treatment steps. So I gained a lot of bench skills regarding paintings conservation, including surface cleaning, consolidation, reintegration, which is filling and in-painting, doing humidity treatments on deformations, conducting tear repairs, and doing strip linings to reinforce margins. And I knew that I wanted to gain more experience with other specialties in the field of conservation and also work in different environments where conservation is practiced. So I came here. And again, very grateful for this opportunity. So some of my goals for this internship personally were to learn about paper, because even though I had used it in my art classes, I didn't really know much about it. And I wanted to, of course, develop some basic conservation skills regarding paper treatments. One of the things that I really like doing is using whatever knowledge I have acquired and seeing how I can apply it to situations in front of me. So I really was looking forward to gaining an understanding and exploring the similarities and differences between paper and paintings conservation to see how they compare and see if I could apply some paintings knowledge to paper or what I could learn more about paintings from paper conservation. And then I also really wanted to gain more experience outside of the private practice field and working in an archives, which is both a government institution and an educational institution, I thought would be a really good opportunity to see just how conservation is practiced in different places. So now we're going to get into what I learned, and I learned and did a lot. So some of the things I'll be going through rather quickly, just so I can get to a few examples that I had to narrow down, because again, there's just so much I want to talk about, but I'll be going into some projects more in depth later on. But I thought that we started with a great foundation of skills, and Sigourney was really great at doing that, starting us with tape removal. As you can see in the image in the center, we had a bunch of pages of different papers with a bunch of different tapes on them, and learning how to remove tape with physical methods, starting with peeling low and slow, and then working towards applying heat with either a heated spatula or a heat gun. We also did some backing board removal by using a scalpel to carefully carve away layers and peel them back on a piece of paper and try not to tear the paper. Surface cleaning was something that I discussed with Kayla, the technician, who showed me how she uses smoke sponges or polyurethane white sponges and just normal white polymer erasers to clear dirt, grime, and markings off of the surface of the documents that she works on. Tear repair is also a really huge part of paper conservation, and Sigourney taught us about using wheat paste to mend tears from the front, putting them back together carefully, and then using different types of Japanese tissue to patch them on the back. And another thing that I did quite frequently was local humidity treatments, using a water brush to just apply water like along a crease or something, and then weighting it and flattening it. Pretty simple stuff, but very applicable in so many different situations. The other big thing that we learned at the beginning was bookbinding, which was kind of a surprise, even though I felt like I was told about it, but I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna make a book, like from scratch. And that has so many different steps into it. So I divided into like 3 main series of steps. You have the making of the text block, which is that big chunk of paper that's attached together without the covers. So you have to fold the signatures, which are those sections of paper that are folded together, and then you have to cut them to the right size. And then you can saw or use a scalpel to cut sewing stations, which are just holes in the side. And then you sew them up, and we sewed them up with tapes, which look like little ribbons down in the corner, you can see there. And then once you've sewn up your text block, you have to put glue on the spine, and then you can round it and back it, which is when you hit it with a hammer. And after you've done that, you get a nice little shape, and you can make end bands, which are those little things at the top and bottom of the spine, and they're really good at protecting the cover from getting too worn if you're pulling a book off a shelf by the top of its spine. That's what it's really good for. And then attaching a piece of fabric, which is called many things, a couple names being wool or cambric, that helps protect the spine and the headbands as well. And then the Oxford Hollow, which is a little folded piece of paper that pops up when you open the book. So the spine kind of pops open. And then you have once you have your text block all fitted out, you get to the casing, which traditional casing includes 2 hard boards and a card of that's a little bit thinner to protect the spine in the middle. You have to measure and cut those things, and also cut the book cloth, and then you have to lay it out and paste it down and fold over the edges and rub it real down smooth. And then you have to attach the spine to it, which was very nerve-wracking at the beginning. And you form shoulders, which was really cool, I thought, by sticking knitting needles into the shoulders of the book and then putting it in the book press. And then once that's all done, you just tape down all your inside parts, like the fabric, that's the mull, your tapes, and then the end leaves that you have. So lots of different steps, but in the end, you have a book. And that's my first book down in the corner, which turned out better than I expected. So now that I had those basic skills under my belt, I felt like I could build upon them and then start applying them to projects. So the bookbinding skills, I tried to challenge myself by, instead of just sewing with tapes, learning how to sew with cords, which is a more traditional method, an older method of bookbinding that relies more on friction. I was also able to experiment with decorative papers and quarter binding, which only has book cloth on about 1/4 of the spine and the covers, and then uses decorative paper on the edges. And it's not too much difficult, more difficult than a normal binding, but just something a little more special. But one of the things that I noticed when I was experimenting with different stitches, like Coptic binding, which is more open binding, I noticed that I was stitching very tightly, and I realized that that was affecting the rest of my book binding. I couldn't hammer the spine into as nice of a shape because the stitching was so tight. So I specifically focused on chilling out and loosening my stitching, not tightening after every time I moved the needle, which really improved my rounding of the spine, and I was able to get this really beautiful shape on my last book that I made. And that was also the first book that I used threads to sew end bands on instead of just making them out of paper. So I spent a lot of time practicing that and took all of those little nuances that I learned into consideration, and I felt like I did a really good job, and I have a really beautiful book at the end. So one of the first projects that I was able to start applying some of the skills that I learned was on a soil map from the archives, and this is of Quitman County. I have the front here, and the back I have enlarged because I really want to focus on the way that I used the decision-making process and taking into consideration the factors that conservators have to think about during the tape removal process, especially on this map, even though I did complete a full treatment of the map. So I mentioned before that the 3 main ways that we physically remove the tape was peeling it back low and slow without heat, or you can add heat to that by heating up a scalpel on like a bottle warmer or any hot surface and start sliding it underneath, or you could use a heat gun to help soften the adhesive while pulling back or using a scalpel. And I'm going to focus on this piece of tape up in the top left corner, excuse me. And that's what it looked like at the very beginning. And you can see I have labeled a couple of different methods that I used. I tried the heat gun first because that was one that I found to like a lot because it was pretty quick. But it's a little bit darker at the bottom corner of that top right image because I held it too close and it kind of burnt the tape. And the tape shriveled up and became really brittle. I realized that that was not going to be the solution for this issue. I then tried just using the heated spatula. I was like, oh, this is actually coming up pretty easily. I wonder if I could just peel it. And peeling it caused a little bit of skinning. So the main consideration I then thought was like the skinning was very minimal, but it depended upon how much residue was left behind. Heating the spatula would soften the residue and leave more residue on the surface, whereas peeling low and slow would pull more of it up. And so I tested to see how easy it was to remove the adhesive residue with a crepe eraser, and it was really easy to pick up without damaging the paper. So I decided that the heated scalpel was the way to go because I could easily remove the residue that it left behind. And after that, I just have a couple of images showing the steps where I finished removing the tape. Then after cleaning up the adhesive residue, there is still a little bit of a shadow left behind, but the paper is much more flexible there, which is what we want. So after doing a couple of maps and getting some bookbinding under my belt, I decided that I wanted to take on more challenges. And that also came with some personal issues that arose, one of them being an injury, well, more of a strain of my wrist and my thumb from overuse, which unfortunately did impact some of the work I was able to do, or basically how I was able to do the work. And one of those things that it impacted was actually the adhesive that I was using. So from the very beginning, we were using wheat paste, which is a paste made from wheat starch and water. And it's really great. It's been used for centuries, specifically in East Asian cultures for mounting, and it's very reversible. It doesn't brittle with age, and you can clear it with water pretty much no matter how old it is. It's wonderful. It's kind of high maintenance though. It likes to go bad really fast. So like it'll get moldy in 3 to 5 days at room temperature, which is kind of gross. And it's very time consuming and labor intensive to make. And you have to stir vigorously for around 30 minutes, which is not great for someone with a wrist injury. So Sigourney actually suggested to me that I consider using a different adhesive. It's not the same as wheat paste because wheat paste is really special, but it's still a very fine adhesive. And she explained to me that's what she used when she was in South Africa, and explained that some places might not have the resources to acquire wheat paste or not have the means to make it on the spot if you're specifically in a place where you can't cook up a batch of wheat paste. So I decided to try it, and it took a little bit of time to get used to, but I really like it, and I can see why this is a very valuable tool to have in your belt, being able to work with different adhesives depending on the situation. So since 2 weeks ago, instead of using wheat paste, I've been using methyl cellulose on all of my projects, and it's been going swell. One of those projects has been another map, which is a little more challenging. First, it's a lot bigger than it's about twice as big as the other maps I was working on. It's about this tall, if you can see me. I think it's about 40 inches tall. It takes up a whole table, and it has these tears, these fractures along the folds of the map, which leave sections kind of flapping around. Because it's so large and you have loose bits, it's very difficult to flip over, which makes it challenging to go back and forth between doing tear mending from the front and then patching from the back. So this project really made me think about the order of operations with how I was choosing to approach my treatment. There were all of these big tears, but there were also these small tears along the edges, and there were lots of tape. And you might not be able to see it from that image, but I made a little diagram where I mapped out all of the issues. I first started mapping the tears in green, and then once I mended them with adhesive, I went over them in pink. And the blue is where all the tape is. So you can see that big crease just covered in tape at the bottom. And knowing that it takes force to remove the tape, I need to stabilize the areas around it so that I'm not making any tears bigger or making any new tears, which meant that I had to start small and work to the larger issues. So from the front, I got as many of those tears put back together as possible And these are some examples of the small ones that I just went around and was gluing them down and trying to get them all done before I could flip it over to do the patching on the back. And there were a lot of tears. And as I said, I was going from smaller to larger ones. So my criteria for choosing which tears to put back together was, there are some tears, as you can see in the bottom right corner, there's one that's next to a piece of tape. That's not really going to lay flat until that tape is gone. So that is going to have to wait. But everything else, if I could get it to lay flat, I stuck it back together. And that included some of these bigger tears, like this one. I haven't completely got it down, but the gap that's kind of floating above, that is now flat, as you can see in the second image. So I've done half of that pretty much from the front already, and will continue working on it from the back now that it is flipped over. So after I got all those little tears done from the front, I started patching them from the back. And one of the issues that I ran into was time and the amount of tears I had. So even though I was really preferring to use a Japanese tissue with adhesive because I felt like it was stronger, we have this stuff called remoistenable tissue that we make from a thin Tengujo Japanese tissue. And what's great about it is that you can just cut a strip of it dry, lay it down, and re-wet it with a water brush. And it's like magic. And it goes a lot faster. So I got almost all of these done in like an hour and a half, which is kind of crazy because it also dries really fast. Very convenient for this. But that was a compromise that I had to make with my own personal issues of like wanting it to be strong because there were so many tears in it. The creases, because they are more delicate and are more susceptible to continuing to fracture, instead of just using the remoistenable tissue, I did use this stuff called dry repair tissue, dry tear tissue. So it comes in these kind of like pre-laid out strips, and you can tear them into these tiny strips. There's an example of one right there. And I've been using that, which does require you to brush on the adhesive, and doing that for a little more security over these creases. So not what I originally planned on doing, but it's still a successful treatment, and it's good enough for the purposes that we need. What's left on this is, now that I've pretty much secured all of the areas I can, is going to take care of all those tape sections. So that is what I will be doing with the rest of my time here. After this presentation, lots of tape removal. The next project that I want to talk to you about was actually kind of an accident. When I was discovering my love of stitching the text block, because I was doing it looser and I felt like I was really getting a feel for how it should be done, I wanted to get more practice. And I found this text block just kind of hanging around in the practice materials, and I saw that it had these holes that were lined up to where those tapes could be, but they weren't. And I thought, hey, maybe I could just put tapes there instead. So I removed all of that adhesive and cut open all of the stitches and ended up resewing the text block with tapes instead. And it actually ended up going better than I expected, because the backing has the spine at an angle, which makes it a little bit harder to poke through things, but it ended up being pretty even, and it just needed a little bit of cleaning up of poking the adhesive away at the end. And once I finished this, I thought, well, this could be a good opportunity to practice recasing, which is something I hadn't done yet. And I found what was left of the original casing in the practice materials cabinet, which was the back cover and the spine. But there was no front cover. And I thought, hey, instead of just doing a whole new casing, what if I just made a front cover and tried to put them back together? Which would end up being a interesting challenge, more than I initially thought it would be. One of the first things I had to do was to prepare the back cover to be reattached, and that meant thinning out the end leaf on the back so that it wouldn't be bulky when I put a new end leaf on top of it. And this was very similar to the backing board removal that I showed you, which was great. It's like, hey, look, I already know how to do this, even though it's kind of different, but it's also kind of the same. So I was able to thin that out, and then on the bottom row of images, you can see how it started. I added the card for the spine and glued that into what was left of the spine. And then I chose for the front cover a more difficult material to work with because I like challenging myself. Actually, the reason I chose it was because the color match was really great to the original casing. And I thought, well, this could be an opportunity to work with a different material. That wouldn't hurt, right? It ended up not being as challenging as I thought because of all of my practice on my other casings. I knew like not to use too much adhesive so it doesn't squish over the edge and then get all over your cover. And those things, those little nuances really helped me make this successful and not a pain like I thought it was going to be. One of the interesting things about this text block was that the first signature was ripped in half, and there were just some pages from the first signature that didn't have their partner in the spread, so they couldn't be sewn back in. So I had to tip those in, and tipping in just means that you put a little bit of glue down the edge and you glue it back down to the text block. And so I did that for each of those pages. And I also tipped in some new end leaves, which are the flaps that protect the beginning of the text block and also pieced down to the inside of the cover. And so that's what it looks like with the end leaves tipped in. Then I got to a challenging part, which was how was I going to put the cover pieces together? So Gordy and I discussed this. She thought that maybe I could attach the back cover by the tapes and then attach the front cover and then fold over the spine and have them meet in the middle. But when I was trying to fit those two pieces together around the text block that I had finished, I realized that the folded over part of the spine cover, I wanted to try and fit the edge of the new cover into that. And I thought that might be difficult to do if I'm folding the covers over on each other. So I thought maybe I could stick them together and then have a whole casing and put that book into the whole casing. And I ended up doing neither of those things because as I was fiddling around, I realized that I had it in a really good spot when it was clamped into this press. And I thought, hey, while I'm like practicing trying to fold this over, I could just glue down the spine right now. Even though the covers aren't glued down, they're kind of locked into place. The only issue was that I needed to create a shoulder to make sure there was enough fabric when I laid down the fabric of the new cover, that there would be enough for a shoulder. So with some creative engineering, we used the knitting needle as we normally would. We just had to clamp it around it, which was kind of interesting. And so I glued down the first flap of the new cover and then pasted down the original spine cover. And I left those little folded bits out so that I could finish up the rest of the book and then tuck them in at the very end. And that's what I did. The rest of the process is very similar to the, jumped. Well, it's very similar to the bookbinding process at the end, just gluing down your mull, your tapes, and your end leaves. And then I had to sort of jerry-rig standing the book up so I could tuck those little folds in, and it ended up working out fine. The last thing I had to do was to just glue down those little bits from the original spine cover just to get them into that shoulder. And now I brought it with me. It's a whole book, which again, like, look at the color match on that. That's pretty good. I love not having to do extra work. The last project I want to talk to you about is, I mentioned earlier that one of the things we did was surface cleaning. I wanted to learn more about a deeper cleaning, and so I asked Sigourney to walk me through washing. And this might look like a lot. These are actually 4 small book pages. They're just double-sided of these mushroom prints that I found I was on a trip in Spain, and there's some staining around the edges, especially on some of them. And I thought that this would be a great opportunity to try and wash them out. So the first step, if you're going to wash something, is to do spot testing. And I don't know if you can see in the very middle along the edge of that first image, there's a little tiny dot, and that's how small of a dot you do with spot testing. So I learned that the dyes or the pigments on the book pages were fine with water, seemingly, and then I tested other solvents that we would use, sodium citrate, which is a chelating agent, which helps target metal ions that might be, and help those, it targets them so that the dirt or grime can become water soluble and it can wash out. And then calcium hydroxide, which is an alkalizer, and it doesn't just, it's not just deacidification, it does help remove some acidic products that are damaged, like the degradation of the paper, but it also leaves behind alkali ions so that it buffers the paper and helps basically prevent future acidification. So I spot tested both of those on all of the different colors in the images, and you might be able to see those little tiny dots. That's where it bled a little bit. So I couldn't use either of those things during my washing experiment. That was okay, I could still use water. So the first step to washing is humidifying whatever you're going to wash, because you want it to be all flexible before you stick it in water or on top of water. Because if one side of it is wet and the other side of it's dry, it's going to get all bent out of shape, and it's not going to like that. So I decided to do an immersion washing, which is where it's completely stuck. It's completely submerged into the water. This is me doing that for the first time, as opposed to a float washing where the piece is just floating on the surface of the water, or blotter washing where blotter is moistened and that is used as the washing tool to get the water onto the paper. And I was like, this is going great. I can do all 4 of these in one little bath. And at about 8 minutes, I started to see this reddish orange color bleeding in the water. I didn't stop to take a picture of it when it was happening because I was freaking out. But I did take a picture of what the water looked like afterwards. And you can see that it's slightly orange, which was a little concerning because I thought that it was safe in water. And this is when I pulled them out. After a few minutes, though, I could see these little pink puddles pooling up, bleeding outside of the images. And I was like, what is happening? And I started like freaking out. I was like, oh my gosh, I've ruined these. Luckily, Sigourney said that she experienced a similar situation where she was washing a print and then it ended up turning pink for no explainable reason at first. And it turns out that there was a print on the other side that had black ink, but part of the black ink was a soluble red-pink part. And just when it was in the water for so long, it came out. And how Sigourney got through it was, if it's water soluble, she decided that she could continue to wash it out. And I thought, you know what? It seems like the other colors aren't affected. It looks like it's just this dark brown color because I was seeing it in the images that had large concentrations of dark brown. I thought it might be a similar situation where there's a lot of different colors mixed into a dark color like that. Maybe one of them is just coming out. So I kept washing it. And I washed it about 4 times, changing the water when it started to turn that color again. After the 3rd time, I noticed that when I laid them out, it wasn't running anymore and pooling up on the surface. So I washed it again. And even though the water was still a little colored, I thought that it would be safe to let them dry completely. And that's what they looked like when they started to dry. And when they're laid out to dry like that and they're not being flattened, they get all crinkly. So my last step in this process was to humidify them again, so they get all nice and flexible. And then you weight them between some pieces of absorbent blotter paper, which is 100% cotton. And they turn out nice and flat. And this is how they look now. So not only did it not really affect the dye, I feel like the paper itself looks brighter. The washing did get rid of a lot of those surface stains. There are still a couple, but it's not very noticeable, especially from like this distance. And I do feel like the images, they do have a unifying color scheme. So I'm very happy with these results. And it turns out that, you know, sometimes mistakes, it wasn't even really a mistake. It's just a happenstance. Good things can still come of that. And one thing that Sigourney told me was that it was a good time and a good place to have an incident like that happen, where it is a safe place to make mistakes and it's not like some valuable piece of artwork. And I'm very grateful to Sigourney for her guidance during that time and to her guidance during this whole experience. So I just also really grateful for this opportunity to practice and make these mistakes, and having a space to do that is really wonderful and unique opportunity and experience. And with that, I want to bring us to the conclusions, like my takeaways. So I did learn a lot, not just the technical skills of, you know, the tear repairs and the tape removal, but also these decision-making skills where I had to consider, you know, these are all of the different factors that conservators think of when they're making these treatment decisions. Learning how to compromise with my own personal expectations of what I want to do, but learning to problem solve with like the time or the materials that I have available, or even my own, you know, personal limitations. And one thing that I am really grateful for is having a more open schedule to learn how I can work most effectively juggling multiple projects. That was really eye-opening for me, and I'm glad I had a space to do that. But I would say one of the biggest takeaways for me was learning a different approach to conservation that I hadn't really experienced before. And it's one thing that Sigourney and Kayla talked about a lot, which is when you approach an object, particularly in the archives needing conservation. So when I was looking at a book, do you think about it as a reference or as a rare book? And that is going to impact how you treat it. So a reference book is going to be preserved for the information that it contains, and it is for people to use. So it's not necessarily going to be focusing on keeping all the original materials, but can it still be used by the people, especially in a place like the archives that has constituents that it serves? So increasing the durability and the longevity of that object and the information that it contains is going to be the focus for that. Whereas a rare book might be seen more as like a historical or an art object. It's special, it's delicate. You want to kind of keep it, not necessarily restoring it back to how it once looked, but you don't want to change too much to it, so it can still be appreciated for what it is. And for me, with the experience that I have in painting as conservation, we always looked at things from the like rare object perspective. They were all fine arts objects. I never had to consider changing my treatment approach based on the use or purpose of an object. And that was kind of eye-opening to me. And I realized that it's going to apply to many more types of objects that I will encounter and in many more places that I will practice conservation. So that is, I would say, like I said, the biggest takeaway for me is just this kind of new perspective that I'll be able to bring with me wherever I go in the future. And that leads me to where will I be going in the future? I am going to be starting to work on graduate program applications because that's always been a goal for me, is to go to graduate school for conservation. But I still want to continue practicing and honing in these new skills that I learned on my own personal projects in my own time, because I still have a lot of my own like personal books that I can definitely work on. I also would really like to learn more about treating paper objects from the perspective of the rare book or the art object, since a lot of the treatments that I've been doing have been on my own books, which I'm treating as books that I want to read again. So that sort of ruggedness, durability. But gaining more of the experience with treating the works of art on paper, where it is like something that you need to be more delicate and conservative with your approach. And now that I've gotten experience in paper conservation and I've had experience in paintings conservation, I will eventually like to move into learning more and getting more experience in objects conservation, because as I found with this, there are many differences between the specialties, but there are also a lot of overlapping between the specialties, and you can really apply a lot of strategies to the different areas. So why not learn as much as I can before going to graduate school? And that leads me to thanking all of the wonderful people who helped make this experience so incredible, specifically Sigourney for being a mentor and a guide and working with me, particularly in the past 2 weeks where things changed a little bit, and meeting me where I was very helpful for me to have such a successful end to this internship. And I also want to thank Tracy and Kayla for just being wonderful people to see in the lab and for answering my questions and letting me borrow their tools. And Amy and James, who are great neighbors and taught me about the wonders and woes of working in the archival side of things, and the rest of the Georgia Archive staffs who have been so welcoming and friendly to me. And I particularly want to thank the Friends of the Georgia Archives and History for providing the funding that allows people like me who want to go into this field so badly the safe space where you can learn and practice and gain experience. So it's a wonderful program, and thank you to the Friends of the Georgia Archives and History for continuing to provide the financial support so that this program can continue and help other people like me gain experience in the field. So thank you. Thanks, Mom. Does anyone have any questions about anything I talked about or anything I might not have talked about?
When you were gluing down things in the books and everything, since you mentioned a couple different adhesives, which one in particular would you use like on the spine or when you were tipping it?
That is an excellent question, and I forgot to mention that the adhesive that we use is a mixture of a pH neutral EVA, which is an ethyl vinyl acetate, kind of similar to a PVA, but it's a little more forgiving in some aspects. So it's 50% of that and 50% of the methyl cellulose, a 3% concentration in water, weight per volume. So lots of fractions. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Melissa. That was Exceptionally good job.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
What are you gonna use that?
Oh, well, I actually take a lot of notes during my conservation experience because I notice things and I like to, when I notice something and I notice like how to improve upon something, I write it down so I don't have to learn it again. So I take a lot of notes. I've already gone through 1 2/3 of notebooks during my time here, so I will likely be using it for more conservation notes. Yes.
So in your experience cleaning the prints
Mhm.
and you have to freak out on colors bleeding out.
Yeah.
And so you sort of stop the process and do some more testing to figure out what's going on. Let's say you find out that that bleeding out process would continue if you continue that same cleaning process. What would be the next steps to take as opposed to, well, this is minor, we can continue cleaning it this way, we're gonna have to change that this way. What would you do there?
So what ended up happening was it did end up being continuing to be water soluble. So I essentially washed out that part of the pigment. If it ended up being an issue where more of the colors were bleeding, you would stop firstly, and then you might be able to do localized cleaning in areas like around the borders where it's the most noticeable. You might be able to, if you can figure out what the pigment might be made out of. I know that you can do localized cleaning with uh, gelling materials, which is something that I learned in painting conservation, and it's also very applicable to paper conservation. So a gel that can like control how much solvent or cleaning agent is going can help pull it up. Or another option is localized bleaching, which is a more aggressive tactic because it is a cosmetic procedure that could potentially be damaging, but in a localized area with like doing as much as you can for that, it's can still be relatively safe depending on what type of bleach you used. Yes, James.
I apologize for the John Goff.
No, it's been wonderful experience.
Every time I encounter one of those, so, the best wishes to you.
Well, I know that, well, I don't know for sure, but I'm 97% certain that the type of tape that I see on this one is going to be the same type that I encountered on the other map. There's also like similar handwriting, and I see similar, like literally the same kind of red pen that is like eaten through a little bit of the tape. So I know that I'll be able to handle it relatively well. It wasn't too tricky to get the tape off. I'm just a little worried about any of the tears that might be way more delicate once the tape is removed. Thank you again for your attention.
Yeah.